History is full of wars. Some are noble, or at least they pretend to be. Some are tragic, fought for freedom, survival, or faith. Some are catastrophic, decided by emperors and kings who fancied themselves gods. And then there's this one. The War of the Bucket, fought in 1325, is one of those glorious reminders that history is not always solemn. Sometimes it is absurd, sometimes it is ridiculous, sometimes it is so silly you would swear it was made up by a bored monk who had been left alone with too much wine and an overactive imagination. But no, this war happened. Real men marched, real horses charged, real people died. And what was the prize? Not a throne, not a fortress, not a chest of gold. The prize was a wooden bucket. Yes, an honest-to-goodness, ordinary, everyday bucket. The kind you'd use to fetch water from a well or perhaps to soak your laundry in. And yet this humble object became the spark that set fire to the centuries-old feud between two proud Italian city-states, Bologna and Modena. The story you're about to hear is not just about war, it's about pride, politics, petty rivalries, and the strange human ability to turn a minor slight into a monumental disaster. To understand how anyone could possibly go to war over a bucket, we need to look at Italy in the 14th century. There was no unified Italy, not as we know it today. Instead, the peninsula was a patchwork quilt of rival city-states, duchies, and republics. Each was fiercely independent, each jealously guarded its prestige, and each absolutely loathed its neighbors. Florence had its bankers and poets, Venice had its ships and spices, Milan had its dukes and iron will, Pisa had its tower, already leaning like a drunk at closing time, Bologna had its scholars, and Modena had grit, stubbornness, and a mean streak of humor. But beneath all of these rivalries was a deeper divide, the great struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs were the Pope's team. They believed the Pope was God's chosen authority on earth, and if he said jump, you asked, how holy should I jump? The Ghibellines backed the Holy Roman Emperor. They thought the Pope was just a bishop in fancy robes, while the Emperor was the true ruler of Christendom. This rivalry ran so deep it split families, friendships, even marriages. People were born into their factions like you're born into a football club. Except this wasn't just about bragging rights on Sundays. This was life and death. And here's the crucial part. Bologna was proudly, fiercely, aggressively Guelph. And Modena, equally, stubbornly, furiously Ghibelline. If you think your neighbors play their music too loud or park in your spot, imagine that, multiplied by 700 years of religious and political animosity. The bucket was just the final straw. Bologna in the 14th century was a heavyweight. With a population around 60,000, it was one of the largest cities in Italy. Its wealth came from trade, agriculture, and its famous university. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, is the oldest in Europe, still operating today. By 1325, it was already world-renowned, attracting students from all over the continent. Law, medicine, philosophy, you name it. Bologna had a scholar ready to argue about it. This gave the city a sense of pride, even arrogance. Bologna thought of itself as cultured, refined, educated, a city that led Italy intellectually and morally. To its leaders, Modena was little more than a provincial irritant, a backwater that didn't know its place. And Bologna loved to remind Modena of it. Bologna's markets bustled with fine goods, its scholars debated Aristotle in Latin, its churches reached toward heaven with lofty spires. Modena, by comparison, had a smaller market square and fewer books. But what Modena lacked in wealth and prestige, it made up for with grit and the occasional prank. Modena was smaller, poorer, overshadowed by its neighbor, but the Modenese didn't see themselves as lesser, far from it. If Bologna was the self-important older brother, Modena was the younger sibling who always fought back, quick with a punch and quicker with a joke. They were staunchly Ghibelline, opposed to papal authority, and fiercely independent. And while Bologna had its scholars, Modena had fighters, farmers, and a deep reservoir of stubborn pride. It didn't matter that Bologna looked down on them. The Modenese knew that underdogs often bite hardest, and when the bucket was stolen, they would prove it. And so, to the spark itself. In 1325, a group of Modenese soldiers raided Bologna. Raids like this were common, stealing cattle, torching barns, or ransacking border villages. But this one took a bizarre twist. Instead of looting treasure or prisoners, they grabbed a bucket. This was no jewel-encrusted chalice, no relic of a saint. It was a plain wooden bucket from a public well in Bologna. The Modenese carted it back to their city like a prized trophy and hung it up for all to see. It was as if they were saying, "Look at this. We didn't just raid you, we took your bucket. What are you going to do about it?" Bologna was livid. This wasn't just theft, this was humiliation. Imagine if your neighbor stole your mailbox and nailed it to their fence, proudly displaying it to everyone who walked by, and every time you saw it, it laughed at you. The Bolognese demanded their bucket back. The Modenese naturally said no. Bologna insisted. Modena doubled down. And so, with logic abandoned and pride in full control, Bologna prepared for war. This was no half-hearted effort. Bologna went all out. They assembled an army of 30,000 men. That's enormous by medieval Italian standards. For comparison, some of the great battles of the 100 Years' War involved fewer soldiers than Bologna was now sending to fetch a bucket. The host included knights in shining armor, mercenaries wielding deadly crossbows, infantry with pikes and axes, and perhaps a few university students who suddenly regretted their course selections. Imagine the recruitment speeches. Men of Bologna, today we march for glory, we march for honor, we march for the bucket. It's enough to make you wonder if the army marched into battle, chanting, "Bring back the bucket, bring back the bucket." Modena, by contrast, could only muster about 7,000 soldiers. Outnumbered more than 4-1, they seemed doomed. But the Modenese had something Bologna lacked: unity, cunning, and the satisfaction of already possessing the bucket. It's hard to measure morale, but surely Modena's was through the roof. After all, they had managed to provoke their mighty neighbor into fielding one of the largest armies in Italy's history, all over a prank. And so on the eve of battle, the Modenese sharpened their swords, tightened their helmets, and perhaps whispered to themselves, "Let's make sure they never get this bucket back." On November 15th, 1325, the two armies met near the village of Zappolino. The Bolognese, confident in their overwhelming numbers, expected an easy victory. They strutted onto the field certain that the day would end with Modena begging for mercy and handing over the bucket. But battles are not won by numbers alone. The Modenese cavalry charged with ferocity, smashing into the Bolognese flanks. Infantry fought tooth and nail, refusing to break. Crossbow bolts whistled through the air, cutting down men and horses alike. And then something happened that Bologna hadn't planned for: panic. Once a medieval army began to waver, it didn't take much for discipline to collapse. Soon, the great Bolognese host began to scatter. Soldiers dropped their weapons and fled. Knights spurred their horses in retreat. What had begun as a confident advance turned into a humiliating rout. By the end of the day, thousands of Bolognese lay dead or captured. Modena, against all odds, had triumphed. And the bucket? Safe in Modena, untouched, probably smirking in spirit. Now here's where the Modenese sense of humor shines brightest. Not content with their victory, not satisfied with keeping Bologna's bucket, they decided to rub salt in the wound. they stole another bucket. Yes, after humiliating their neighbors in battle, they went back and pinched a second pail, because if history has taught us anything, it's that nothing makes a point quite like overkill. Picture the Modenese leadership around a table. Gentlemen, we've won a glorious victory, defended our honor, and humiliated our neighbor. What next? Steal another bucket. Brilliant. Bologna's humiliation was legendary. They had marched with one of the largest armies medieval Italy had ever seen, and they had been utterly crushed by a force a quarter their size. Their pride was shattered, their reputation mocked, their bucket gone forever. Modena, meanwhile, basked in the glow of victory. Their triumph was celebrated, their underdog reputation cemented, their bucket proudly displayed. The rivalry between Bologna and Modena didn't end here, of course. These were Italian city-states. We could safely assume they kept fighting over land, taxes, and insults for centuries, but nothing ever topped the glorious absurdity of the bucket war. What makes this story richer is to imagine daily life in these cities. In Bologna, the markets buzzed with chatter. Bakers sold crusty loaves, scholars debated theology in Latin, and city officials strutted about in fine robes. The city was proud of its learning, its architecture, its laws. In Modena, life was simpler, but no less proud. Farmers sold grain, artisans hammered iron, soldiers trained in the square. The jokes were earthier, the wine perhaps stronger. And behind it all, the stubborn independence of a people who hated being told what to do. When word spread that Modena had humiliated Bologna, one can imagine the taverns erupting with laughter. They came for the bucket, and we still have it. Let us pause and imagine the bucket itself. Born of oak, iron-banded, sturdy and unassuming, it spent its early life drawing water from a Bolognese well. It served the people faithfully, day after day. And then abduction, carried off by laughing soldiers, hoisted aloft like a crown jewel, paraded through Modena's streets. I was just a bucket, it might say, but pride made me priceless. I am the only bucket in history to start a war. And centuries later, it still hangs in Modena, a silent witness to human folly. The War of the Bucket is unique, but not alone. Humanity has a rich tradition of fighting over nonsense. In 1859, Britain and America nearly went to war over a pig shot on the San Juan Islands. It was literally called the Pig War. Thankfully, nobody but the pig died. In 1328, the French and English quarrelled over a dispute about a throne that led to the 100 Years' War, long, bloody and tragic. Compare that to the Bucket War, shorter, sillier, but no less real. And in Denmark, legend says there was once a fight over a stolen ship's anchor. Humans, it seems, are endlessly inventive in the causes they choose. Tell me in the comments if you want me to make an episode with one of these. And here's the incredible part. The bucket still exists. Yes, you can still see it today. The very same wooden pail hangs in Modena's Torre della Ghirlandina, the city's great tower. It has survived centuries of wars, revolutions, empires, and modernity. Tourists take pictures of it. Guides tell the story with pride. And somewhere in Bologna, there is still a faint sense of resentment. Imagine being a Bolognese schoolchild hearing this story for the first time. So we raised 30,000 men? Yes. And we lost to 7,000? Yes. And the bucket is still in Modena? Yes. Today, the War of the Bucket lives on as a punchline. But it's also a reminder that history is not just about emperors and kings. Sometimes it's about wooden pails, neighborly pranks, and the wild excesses of human pride. So the next time you see a bucket, whether in your garden, your garage, or in a medieval tower in Modena, remember, this humble object once inspired tens of thousands of men to march into battle.
And if that doesn't make you laugh and shake your head at the human race, nothing will.